Good day, everyone. Thank you for coming. First, before I start, I would like to thank Kadwa and the government of United Arab Emirates for inviting me and UNESCO to be present at what I think is a very important event, especially celebrating International Day of the Teacher. My talk today, I want to keep it interactive, so perhaps we can leave some time for questions. Focuses on effective teaching and learning for sustainable development. Before I go on, perhaps I should say a word or two about myself. I'm Jordan Naidoo. I'm the Director for Education 2030 SDG 4 at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, mainly coordinating our global work on SDG 4. For those of you who do not know the acronym, SDG 4 is Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education as part of the UN's education, at least Sustainable Development Goals. We have 17 goals which are interconnected, and Goal 4 is on education. It has 10 targets, and one of the targets, target number 4.7, covers education for sustainable development amongst many other things. It looks at environment, peace building, human rights, culture, and so on. So in some ways, it's a catch-all target of the Sustainable Development Goal 4. I'm going to say a few things about the goal, and in particular, how it relates to teaching and learning and the role of teachers. So just as an introduction, I thought perhaps we should locate ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, within the broader SDG agenda. If you think of the Transforming Our World Agenda 2030, it focuses in some ways on 5 Ps: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And in some ways, the role of the teacher within delivering on those 5 Ps is central. We had last week in New York, the UN General Assembly focused largely on climate action. We had, world attention drawn to the issue of protecting our planet by a young activist from Norway, Thornberg. So I think there is clear recognition that education is fundamental to protecting our planet and ensuring a sustainable future. So let's look at 1 or 2 key points with regard to education and education for sustainable development. With sustainable development, there are 3 basic pillars upon which we have to focus. One is the environment, and we see greater attention to that with the focus on climate action. 2, on the economy. In a way, our future depends on an economy that is equal, an economy that is forward-looking and addresses the needs of all people. And thirdly, both the environment and the economy depends for our success on people. No matter the technological changes we have, whether we think of artificial intelligence and so on, we live in and within communities. We live in societies, and therefore, education for sustainable development is about how we live together in a peaceful, self-fulfilling world. I think an important point in all 3 pillars is that we cannot achieve success across all 3 pillars without education. And when we think of education, it's about education from even before birth. I think it's one key concept of the SDG agenda is lifelong learning. So we have to think of the way we develop each other, our skills and competencies have to start early and go throughout life. Even whether you 6 months old or 82 years old, we need to be learning to be protective of our environment. And this depends not just for life, not just for work, but for a better quality of life. And I think most importantly, we cannot do so without education that is holistic and comprehensive, and that allows each and every citizen, whether you live in Abu Dhabi, Johannesburg, London, or Timbuktu, to be able to be active citizens contributing to all aspects of their life. So one key idea of a sustainable development is creating a democratic culture. And I think this is also links to the global citizenship competencies we will speak about in a little while. And as I said, if you look at SDG 4, Goal 4 of the Sustainable Development Agenda, clearly we have a target that focuses on education for sustainable development, target 4.7. So to come back to a key point about the whole agenda is to recognize fully that if we are able to make sure that education delivers on the faith that we have in it as a fundamental point of all of the goals, whether we talk about health, whether we talk about economy, whether we talk about peace and justice, whether we talk about consumption, nutrition, education is connected to all of it. But there was a question in this morning's plenary to one of the panelists. Why do we talk about competencies today? All of the people, many of the older people like me, went through schooling that was very traditional, but I think we did develop skills that are critical thinking, cooperative skills, working together in teams. So how did we manage for some people to achieve those skills, but not all? And I think that's the key question. If I think back of even the caveman living in a cave and being able to adapt to his environment, they did have adaptability, they did have critical skills. But the difference today is that the world is totally interconnected. We live in a global community. Secondly, the speed of change is far different from what we had to deal with in the past. And I think those two components really calls for a reorientation and a rethinking of what we mean by education. In some ways, over the last few years, we've seen, through the influence of OECD, through the influence of the Education Commission, a focus on learning outcomes. I think that is quite important. However, by limiting it purely to learning outcomes, I think we are not looking at holistically the role of education. We need to reorient the way we think, the way we teach, the way we learn, and I think most importantly, the way we connect to each other within education. And this therefore calls for a reorientation of education across the board, from policy to practice, focusing on the context of learning. Our schools generally have been made for the industrial age of 200 years ago. In 90% of the countries that UNESCO works in, we still have schools that are in the traditional model. Within a building, a classroom, accommodating in some countries where if you are lucky, 20 children. In other countries where you are unlucky, you have 100 children in the same size classroom. We have very much the same reliance on the same types of books, the same types of methodologies offered. In many cases, it is changing, but by and large, it's the same. So the context of learning has to change. Our schools have to be more connected to the community. We can't have schools that are built with millions of dollars but only open for 7 hours in a day, from 8 to 2:30, 3:30. Yet another 15 hours, 14 hours, 12 hours of the day, they are unused. So that context has to change. The styles of buildings have to change. Then more importantly, the actual content of learning has to change. In many cases, as in UAE, we have curriculum reform. We see lots of changes, new competencies added, but we also have a challenge. as we want to develop more competencies, the load on the teacher becomes quite unbearable. The curriculum breadth increases all the time. And we expect the teachers to be teaching more, kids to be learning more, but we have the same limited of time. So the content of learning has to adapt to the process of learning. We have to be smarter about the way we teach and learn. And I think this requires a complete reorientation of education and teaching and learning. However, we should not leave behind the fundamentals about teaching and learning. This does not mean that robots and AI are going to replace teachers. Teaching and learning, in fact, I think back to my own teacher education almost 40 years ago. One of the most critical books that I've read in sociology is called The Social Construction of Reality. That knowledge creation, the development of competencies is a human activity. We have to still not forget that fact, even as we draw on technology. We have to recognize that teachers do matter. Teachers and learners are at the center of the learning process. And so no matter what people say, however, to be teachers in a new world, we have to do things differently. And I think that's where we have the idea of both new competencies for children and learners, but also new competencies for teachers. So I think many of you are teachers. I was a teacher for a long time. So I think in some ways I'm preaching to the converted. But however, it's important to recognize the importance of teachers, not just as purveyors of knowledge, but clearly teachers are critical to our future, both because they develop and shape attitudes, skills, they develop children's potential. We say the future depends on young people, but the future also depends on teachers who interact with young people. And I think that cannot be lost. So when it comes to education for sustainable development, across the curriculum, and not just in certain subjects, teachers play a critical role. So one of the ideas I think that was mentioned this morning, the idea of a community of practice, the idea of community of teachers, the education for sustainable development is the responsibility of every individual within a school and in a community. It cannot be left to specialists or to particular people. And I think, therefore, teachers play a critical role, both within the school and as representatives within the community. However, and this I think is very important, Education International, the largest teacher union, global teacher union, always stresses the point that we put a lot of burdens on teachers. We expect a lot of teachers, and teachers cannot be, miracle workers. They need support. Teachers' conditions of service have to be improved. They need professional development support all the time. And I go back to one point I think that needs to be made in the context of this year's International Day of Teachers. The theme for this year is young teachers. And I think young teachers, many countries, you have an aging teacher population, you have large shortages. Globally, we need 69 more million teachers. So we do have to attract young teachers. However, at the same time, we have to recognize that all teachers need to be young. All teachers need to have the spirit of enjoying teaching, of being supported, and forever. I recall always somebody said to me almost 20 years ago that, I have 30 years of experience as a teacher. And somebody replied, no, you have 1 year of experience times 30, because the first year you went into school, you did the same thing every year after. And for many teachers, this is so. And it's not entirely their fault. I think we don't have systems that actually encourage teachers to be learners, to change and to adapt to the curriculum, to adapt to life outside the classroom. So I think this is part of what ESD and global competency means, is creating teachers that are learners and not just somebody who thinks that I can read a book and share knowledge. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I just wanted to refer back to one of the critical publications produced by UNESCO almost, I think, over 25 years ago. That was captures the Delors report, which captures 4 pillars of learning: learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together, and learning to be. UNESCO is planning to do a new publication in 2021 that kind of reflects on Delors but takes us into the new century. And it's called The Futures of Learning. It takes into account the new competencies, it takes into account the technologies, the fact that we are more interconnected. But I think even as we look to the future, the Delors report and these 4 pillars really are still relevant today. And even more so if we look at the last 2 competencies in terms of learning to live together and learning to be. We can develop all of the competencies, but we don't live in isolation. Humans are communal beings. We have to recognize that from the day we are born, we are put in families, and we are in communities, we are in societies. So those skills that we talk about in terms of global competencies are really important. But I want to focus back on what do the 4 pillars mean for teachers. I think the first, teachers must show an understanding of local and global challenges of sustainable development and know their role together with learners in tackling the challenges we face. Secondly, teachers must demonstrate practical skills and action in relation to education for sustainable development. Third, the teacher has to work with others in ways that help learners develop social skills, partnerships, and an appreciation of interdependence, difference, pluralism, mutual understanding, and peace. Fourthly, the teacher has to have the ability to act with greater autonomy. Teachers have to be given freedom to interpret and deliver the curriculum in a way that is relevant to their local context. And finally, I think this comes linked to the question of personal autonomy. Teachers have to have freedom, but also have to be held accountable. But that accountability cannot be imposed from outside. It has to be an accountability that's mutually developed. So to go back, what are the essential characteristics of ESD, or Education for Sustainable Development? I mentioned earlier that teachers cannot be effective if they are not supported. And while we have new teachers coming in and the reform of the pre-service training is required, because in many, many countries, our teacher training, both in service and pre-service, is outdated. The kinds of training that we are doing are still relevant to schools from a past era. So what do we have to do so that teacher training becomes more focused on ESD? One, every subject within a teacher training curriculum has to have ESD principles, not just specialized subjects, but across, as we would do in a school curriculum, to mainstream across all subjects and disciplines. In fact, we have to think differently and not think of subjects as such. We have to think of in a different way. The second thing is that we have to look at real life examples of education for sustainable development. They cannot be theoretical or transported from one context to another without localization. Thirdly, in teacher training, we have to prepare teachers for teaching for lifelong learning, not just teaching for the year that they are in a particular school. They have to look at their teaching and learning as a vocation, which it was in many cases in the past, where you teach both in the classroom, in the community, and elsewhere. And I think this is also very critical. Teachers must develop the competencies to be able to use adaptive technologies, to be able to use adaptive methodologies that are living and adaptable all the time. Somebody asked the question to Andreas Fleischer from OECD, what is the most effective way of ensuring the competencies we need, whether it's critical thinking, collaborative teamwork, creativity, problem solving. And one of the things that Andreas said, it's about active learning. And I agree to some extent. we do need more active learning because many of our schools are still in a transition mode, like I'm doing now, standing in front of the classroom and lecturing. Most schools are still that way. But I would add, it's not just about active learning. It's about multiple strategies for learning. There will be circumstances where you have to use active learning strategies. In other circumstances, a learner may have to have a space to sit and reflect in his own mind on those competencies. I think the most effective teacher is a teacher who is adaptable, who can use multiple effective methodologies that are relevant to the skill that we are trying to develop. In some circumstances, it's also necessary to be able to develop rote learning strategies. So I think that is important. We need strategies for encouraging peer learning. So I think the teacher who can adapt, who can learn himself and teach himself is the most effective teacher. And another important point, we have too many divisions between formal, non-formal, and informal. We have to think of learning as a continuum across all contexts. And perhaps most importantly, a difference from the past is to ensure that learning is linked to real life situations. We need to do much more that takes students outside the classroom, outside the four walls of the classroom. I remember when I taught almost 30 years ago, and I was teaching in a country that was very top-down, that kind of drilled students into what they should learn. I was born and grew up and taught in South Africa under apartheid. So we were treated as second-class citizens, and we were told to try to teach our students to accept that. And one of the things, it was a high inspector-driven system. And I was teaching English poetry. So I'd take my kids outside the classroom and teach. I'm teaching a poem about, I don't know, the snow on the cherry trees of Robert Frost, where kids, we didn't have television, so they can't imagine what snow is. They can't imagine what a cherry tree is. And I'm supposed to sit in a classroom of 35 degrees heat and teach kids. But my headmaster and my inspector would tell me, no, if you go outside the classroom, you are not teaching, and the kids are not learning. So I think one of the things we have to do when it comes to education for sustainable development, if we are talking about protecting the environment, you've got to take the children to the landfill, for example, to look at what the impact of garbage, you have an ocean. You have to demonstrate to them the impact of, bad consumption, bad environmental knowledge can have on the environment. So it has to be much more project-based. And I think the last point, and this comes back to the competencies in terms of problem solving, creativity, and critical thinking. There has to be this dialectic of thought. And somebody said this earlier, not everything modern is better. So we have to look at how we connect our past with the future and the future with the past. Culture has value, but not all culture is sacred. We have to look at what is relevant to the present and the future. At the same time, while looking ahead, we also have to look back and make sure we retain all that is of value from our past and from our culture as we adopt. Thank you. I have a minute left, so I'm going to try and end up. I think I've covered this in terms of the integration of ESD across, from policy to practice, looking at the actual outcomes. One of the final things I would say is that we have to learn to assess what we do as teachers better. But assessment does not just mean participating in PISA or in other international assessments. It has to be a continuous process of assessing what you teach and getting your learners to assess what they learn. We may need global and regional assessments, but most importantly, it's a system of continuous assessment. I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.